Today's video is for my fellow Christian creatives. I'm here to tell you that you are not a poor, starving, desperate artist. You might be thinking to yourself right now, yes, I am poor. My creative outlet is not paying the bills. What if I told you that's exactly where Satan wants you? He wants you to feel disempowered. But as a creator, especially as a writer, whether you sell 5 or 5 million books, you're still a powerful force of influence. You're a leader by a different style, and perhaps one of the most influential ways to be a leader, because storytelling influences the subconscious and it makes people think. And for a Christian, this is a both empowering and scary position to be in. Your creativity is a weapon to be used by God or Satan. And if you aren't paying attention, you'll be working for the latter. Now, before we get into the power influence that you have as a creator, let's first take a look at biblical standards versus personal conviction. It is essential that creators understand the difference between the two because it governs what we create. And while I'm excited to see that more readers are feeling convicted about what they're reading, I've seen so many readers saying that they're getting rid of their spicy books because God has convicted them about the material that they're reading. And while I'm really happy to see this, I do feel a bit frustrated that most of these people, and I've seen them mostly on Book Talk, who add the caveat that, hey, these are my personal convictions. I'm not saying you have to toss them out. And those weren't personal convictions, those are biblical standards. I've seen this happen several times where a Christian will quote 1 Corinthians 6:12, where Paul in his letter to the church of Corinth writes, "All things are lawful unto me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I'll not be brought under by the power of any." When taken out of context, this verse does sound like it's saying Christians have permission to do whatever they want. But when you put it into the context that is actually in, Paul is saying the very opposite. He uses it twice in 1 Corinthians as a rhetorical device. He is telling the church of Corinth what their mindset is, and then he is refuting it. Very much so. So I don't take my word for it. I encourage you to read the book of 1 Corinthians all the way through in one sitting. That is how it was meant to be read because it is a letter to the church of Corinth who is having this problem. And of course, as you know, if you're a writer especially, you should know that context is everything. I'm sure there's already viewers who are on the defense right now, worried that I'm being judgmental or condescending. If you see my other videos, I always take a temperate approach. I had this unique upbringing where I had many family members that leaned towards legalism. So you had to be like perfect, where almost everything was off limits and bad. And then I had other family members that leaned closer to antinomialism. I may have mispronounced that. But basically, what you're saying, anything's permissible because of the grace of God. And both of those viewpoints are incorrect. We don't get to heaven through our works, and we don't keep sinning. And like Romans 6:1 and 2 says, what shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin so that grace may abound? Certainly not. How shall we who died to sin live any longer in it? So, no, not everything is permissible for a Christian because Jesus died for our sins. We still are supposed to walk the walk. And I'm going to talk about the burden that comes with being a creator versus a consumer and where we kind of fall in this. Much of what Christians today call personal conviction are actually biblical standards. Things like not engaging with pornographic material, getting drunk, a lack of modesty, the occult, or extramarital sex. These aren't personal convictions. Those are all biblical standards. The individual who is engaging with the material may have been personally convicted, but that's because the Holy Spirit is telling them to live up to the biblical standard, not that it's for them exclusively. All Christians are supposed to try to meet these standards. Now, give people grace if someone just became a Christian. Most of the time, these are not going to be overnight changes. But if you are walking around calling yourself a Christian, and if you're creating entertainment, whether it's books, films, games, whatever, you need to make sure that you're living up to these biblical standards because as the whole book of 1 Corinthians is about, We do not want to lay stumbling blocks in front of other people or encourage sin. Now, what is a personal conviction? Because those do exist. Personal conviction is when God has a different standard for you that you need to live up to. And there's a couple of reasons that for this. It's for you, or it could be for someone close to you, or what God is calling you to do. Think of it like a target. Every Christian is supposed to hit somewhere on the target. If you're hitting a bullseye or near the edge of the target, you're still hitting the biblical standard. Now, if you see a Christian who is not hitting the target, we are supposed to kindly pull them aside and help them get back on target. Not in a judgmental, mean way, but in a, hey, I'm invested in you as a fellow Christian and I want you to do well. And I don't want you to fall into sin. Because sometimes when sin looks fun, it's not. And it leads to things like anxiety, depression, addiction. It's not a good thing. Now, when God gives you personal conviction, that's Him making that target smaller for you. Now, when God calls you to a personal conviction, it is not your job to go around and say, hey, I see you're having a glass of wine. You cannot drink at all because God says, I can't drink at all. You can't have a glass of wine. The Bible says we're not supposed to be drunk, but it doesn't say alcohol as a whole is bad. Alcohol is an easy example because it's been so abused over history. Whether you're talking about trying to completely outlaw it or say that no one can have a sip of alcohol, or the other side where many people become drunks or their life revolves around drinking, that's kind of the extremes of it. Now, God, for a personal conviction, God may call you to stay away from alcohol. This could be that you have alcohol addiction in your family. It could be that you aren't good at handling alcohol, that you have one drink and next thing you know, you're passed out drunk. It could be that someone close to you cannot handle alcohol. And so you, for their sake, need to stay away from it so you don't cause them to stumble. That is a personal conviction. And if God gives you a personal conviction, it is in your best interest to listen. Another example might be something like video games. While video games are not evil and people can play video games, God might tell you that you can't play them because perhaps when you play them, you ignore all responsibility or you get really angry when you play. If those are some issues for you, then maybe God will give you a personal conviction to not play video games. But that doesn't mean you go around and tell other Christians that they can't play. Now, because it'll inevitably come up, why are spicy books or sex scenes, or why is that a biblical standard? Because it leads people to lust. Science even backs this up. When you're talking about modesty standards across all cultures, if you go back far enough in time, an ankle was enough to get somebody excited. Most people today aren't going to be excited about an ankle. And in other communities where they're used to women walking around topless, that doesn't excite anybody. But there is one thing that unites across culture that gets people's libido going, and that is actually witnessing the act, which includes your video game sex scenes, your TV, and visualizing it in your books. So that is why that one is definitely a biblical standard, not a personal conviction. So, what does this have to do with creatives, you might ask? It goes back to us being leaders. And we need to see ourselves as such. Whether you're making music or books or stories, games, whatever, you are an influence, you're a leader, and we have to keep that in mind. Because of this, we have to ensure that our work doesn't lead people to sin. And we do this by looking at content and its likelihood to lead someone to sin. There is undoubtedly content created in the world that is meant for people to sin. There's the saying, sex sells for a reason. So back to the sex scenes. If you're a Christian out there and you're like, hey, I can read these scenes or watch these shows because I don't feel anything when I see them, I'm afraid to tell you that you are probably already super desensitized to it, which is a whole other issue. You can see my spicy book video for more on that and why that's bad for your psyche. And that's a good sign that you do need to pull away from that kind of content. Another less talked about type of content that leads people to sin is vengeful and violent narratives. A good example, a little old at this point, but this was one that stood out from my childhood. The movie Sin City. It encourages the viewer to imagine themselves enacting their revenge on their enemies. And that very concept goes against biblical principles. Proverbs 24 17 through 18 says, "Do not rejoice when your enemy falls, and do not let your heart be glad when he stumbles, lest the Lord see it and it displease him." So if we are creating content or consuming content that is making us excited and we're like, yeah, I want revenge, I love it. That's a heart posture problem that we need to pray about, and we need to disengage from that kind of material. And as creators, we should not be creating that kind of material. So there is content that is guaranteed to make people sin. And this is one that consumers and creators should 100% avoid. The Bible is full of warnings to Christians about causing one another to stumble. Most notably, Matthew 18:6-7, "Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depths of the sea." I need you to take a moment and think about that. This was red text. If Jesus said that it is better for you to be drowned in the sea than to make other people sin, especially children, we need to take that seriously. But not all content is guaranteed to make people sin. So there's also content that is likely to make people sin. This can look like a story where the characters have a steamy scene or they are lusting after one another throughout the whole narrative. This creates feelings of lust without ever having to have the bedroom scene. This can also be how art is drawn. You can easily think about a lot of sexually charged animated characters, whether on video games or TV shows. Those kind of characters are there to elicit a certain kind of attraction. Now, when you're a Christian consumer, I would say that this kind of content is one you need to be discerning about. Is this content going to lead you or someone else that might be watching with you or reading the book behind you to sin? If it is, then toss it out. Now, not everyone is going to be led to sin by steamy scenes or sexually charged characters, and that's where your personal discernment comes in. But as a creator, we should be avoiding this kind of content because by design, it is there to create sinful thoughts. And we have no business as Christians tempting our fellow humans. And this doesn't mean you can't have a convincing romance story. Like, I do want to believe that the characters love each other, but you don't have to make it lustful. Lust and love are very different. That's a conversation for another time. And the third category that I put content in is one that is not really going to lead anyone to sin, with the caveat that they may have something that triggers their sin, but it's uncommon. So let's use romance for an example. It's very easy one to see the scale of the extremes for it. So we talked about on the far end of the scale are going to be sex scenes, which are absolutely a no. And then we have steamy or kind of lustful thoughts as the likely. And then the unlikely is a kiss. Most people aren't going to be led to sin by reading or seeing a kiss on TV unless they have consumed too much sensual content. Then their brains may jump from a kiss all the way to the bedroom. And that's, as a creator, is not something that you need to worry about if you're writing a kiss. Now, as a consumer, if that's an issue that you have, it is good to completely pull away from all of that for a while and detox so that you can engage with what is supposed to be safe material in a healthy way. So as a creator, writing a kiss scene is okay because it's not going to lead the general population to sin. And this concept goes to all content, not just romance. And of course, if you know someone close to you does have a problem with content that most people don't bring it up around them. As a creator, one of the most important things we need to do when we are making content is to step back and ask ourselves, what are we encouraging the consumers to imitate? For example, this one has always been a hot debate in the Christian community, Harry Potter. While a lot of the themes and the content in it is okay, and some of it is some good themes and some good characterization, the downside is that it encourages consumers to imitate being a witch or a wizard. It encourages them to play with wands and say spells, maybe make potions. And while there are many people who grew up with Harry Potter that did not become obsessed with it or get into witchcraft because of it, there are many who did, probably almost many more who did. And that's the problem where it lies. The story itself might be okay. And that as a consumer is up to you. Is that going to be something that is going to make you or your kids want to be a witch? But as a creator, we shouldn't make this kind of content because it encourages people to imitate being a witch. Another example is the tabletop game Cyberpunk. If you read through the rule book, it very much encourages you to be a lowlife who looks out for themselves and will do whatever they need to get theirs. This isn't a fantasy that, as a creator, we should be encouraging for consumers because it leads them into a unhealthy and unbiblical mindset. Now, in 2 weeks, I'm going to talk more about tabletop games and if Christians should engage with it and how. So if you don't want to miss that, subscribe so you can check that video out when it hits. On the other side, there are many videos, books, and games that encourage the consumers to be good people. A good example of this is superhero movies. Most superhero movies encourage the consumer to be heroic, to be selfless, and to think about the little guy. And that is a great thing. As a creator, you can create content that encourage this kind of behavior. The good and the bad thing about the art is that once you are done making it and it's out in the world, it takes on a life of its own. There will always be consumers that will idealize the bad guys or take the wrong message out of your story. But as long as you've been conscientious and you've done your best to make sure that your story encourages good things from those who engage with it, it's not on you if somebody takes the wrong message or idolizes the wrong character. So always remember to be a good steward of the talent that God gave you and use it to uplift his kingdom and his principles and not Satan's. Now, it's easy to fall into a more nihilistic mindset and ask ourselves, why do we create at all if inevitably something could lead someone to sin? Too often I've seen Christians say that other Christians shouldn't even be involved in entertainment or at the very least in secular entertainment. And this is a lie of the devil. We need to be involved in entertainment and secular entertainment, especially because stories and storytelling, whether it's books, movies, video games, are one of the biggest moral influences on our culture. And if we are not in those spaces, we are not giving our culture a fighting chance. We're not influencing them at all. We're leaving everything up to the world and how the world says issues should be handled. And we know the wisdom of the world is pretty terrible. And then, of course, you'll hear me say on this channel many, many times, we cannot over sanitize our work. And that's one of the big issues a lot of Christian creators have done is that we take one extreme or the other where we completely over sanitize our work and we don't reflect the world as it is. And it does a huge disservice to consumers. And in my next video, I'm going in depth about violence in entertainment and where we draw the line on that and how much is okay. So remember, we always have to present the world honestly, but also edifying. But overall, you don't know what seeds your work may plant, what hope you could give to consumers, and what hearts you can change. Jesus used parables when he talked to people because he understood that as humans, we learn best through stories. And not necessarily even giving the answers to us is when we get to ruminate on the stories and ask yourselves, what does it mean? And what does it mean for us? So make sure that whatever influence you have as a creator is an influence that will make God say, well done, good and faithful servant.